morning, Penn State fans. It is, I don't know if you can hear me, but we will get this rolling
I got
now.
you, Greg.
All right. Good morning, Penn State fans. It's BWI Live, Wednesday, January 15th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. It is 2025, but as we did in these very rooms on this very YouTube channel with you, our very loyal listeners, at this time a year ago, we are going to spend the next hour talking primarily about Penn State receivers, which is the surprise of no one as we move into the 2025 season and the Nittany Lions have turnover a turnover at large, rather, in the wide receivers room. T. Frank, good morning. How are you doing on January 15th? For those who are keeping track at home, the portal window for Penn State players technically closed on Tuesday at 11:59 p.m., but there is the 48-hour administrative paperwork window, so you could see Penn State players pop into the portal as late as Thursday. And today is NFL Draft Declaration Deadline Day for underclassmen. So we're going to kind of play it loose and fast on this edition of BWI Live. We don't know what's coming over the next hour that we may need to stop and change course and talk about. But T. Frank, the offseason is here. Obviously, Penn State, Notre Dame, and the Orange Bowl is still on the mind of many Penn State fans. But for the Nittany Lions inside the Lash building, right now it's all about building toward 2025.
Yeah, so with all these decisions, it's been how my mind works is like every time there's a breaking news item, I'm like, we got to do a video. But like it's all been compressed into a 4-day span. So I'm kind of just letting it wash over me and just we'll get to them when we get to them. And we're getting, luckily, you guys are awesome. And we do 3 shows a week. So there's plenty of time to talk about them. Maybe not in the exact moment, but right here on the show, we'll be getting to a lot of that. We can break down, I think, in a more complete sense, the receiver room today, more so than we did. We could have yesterday in the moment, especially with both Trey Wallace and Amari Evans declaring a couple hours after each other. So I think that it's a fairly straightforward application of resources at this point. And from the last 24 hours, I think the biggest news is on the defensive side of the ball, despite all of that receiver information.
Yeah, I agree with you. We'll get into all that and much more. If you didn't see it this morning, about, maybe 45 minutes ago, Justin Lustig, the Penn State special teams coordinator, putting out a tweet that Riley Thompson, Ryan Barker, Gabe Nwusu, and Tyler Duzansky will all return to Penn State in 2025. No real surprises there. The only one, I think, so 3 of them, all but Barker, did have NFL draft eligibility should they have chosen to go after it, which I don't think any of them really gave it much consideration. But at the same time, Riley Thompson, remember, got 2 extra years of eligibility from the NCAA due to the way things worked when he came over from Australia. So point being, he could have decided he didn't want to spend another year in college, but he will. So Penn State will have its starting punter back and will ultimately return all of its specialists in 2025 with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen back as kick returners, and then Zion Tracy and Caden Saunders coming off an injury-shortened season. My question for you, T. Frank, not on the rundown, but let's start with this, and then we're going to move to the receivers. Penn State finished, I think, in the back half of quite a few special teams metrics this year in the return game. And I think more than anything, that's what Penn State fans will be interested in as we move into spring practice is, can there be more explosiveness in the Penn State return game? Ryan Barker took over for Sanders Sahadak, was fine for the most part as the kicker. Gabe Nwusu had some issues with kicks going out of bounds, but was mostly fine as a kickoff specialist. Riley Thompson, I think, probably took a slight step back from last year compared to this year, or this year compared to last year, rather. Yeah. And then, the return game, especially the punt return game, they never got anything going in that, no matter who was back there.
Yeah, and I think Zion Tracy did a good job, other than some brain farts in the final game, but generally provided a little more of that returnability. But Penn State is pretty conservative, it seems. It comes down to, I think, decision-making in those moments, right? And so I'm not a special teams coach. I have studied offense, defense. I have never studied special teams because it's just like there's so much going on there that I don't want to deal with when I'm doing with all the other plays. But generally, James Franklin has talked about catching the ball first, preserving field position via fair catch, opposed to making a play. And so I think there is a bit of conservatism there. And then it comes down to the trust of the player. And I think they trusted Zion Tracy to return the football. And he has the athleticism. They just didn't have a lot. I don't think they had too many opportunities where you'd say they gave him a good return window from the coverage unit, because it felt like there were a lot of fair catches because guys were right on him. So I that's just a kind of a drive-by assessment. I don't know if that's correct or not, but that's just kind of my feeling, having watched special teams the past year, that it didn't seem like there were a ton of opportunities really to return the football. And when you only have a couple of games anyway, you need to make the most of those. And I don't know how you change that from the coverage or the team standpoint to give that returner the ability, because Tracy has the ability. And I think that competition can get better with the players on the roster now. But at the same time, like, I don't think that they were lacking the talent at the returner position.
Yeah. All right. Well, the special teams will be something we'll have all offseason to dive into, but wanted to share that bit of news with everyone as we get into our stay or go transfer portal conversation that is going to primarily, as the comment section is indicating, focus on the wide receivers. So if you've somehow missed all of the activity over the last 24 to 48 hours or so, Trey Wallace and Omari Evans both hit the portal, as Steve Frank mentioned, within an hour of each other on Tuesday, January 14th. Tyler Johnson and Mekhi Flowers, two backup receivers who have been at Penn State for a couple of years, both decided to move on. Earlier this week, and of course, Devontae Ross from Troy and Kyron Hudson from USC joined Penn State via the transfer portal and committed in December and started classes at Penn State back on Monday when the spring semester started. So Penn State looking at a pretty good overhaul of its receivers room in 2025. Liam Clifford is a guy who still has a decision to make. Anthony Ivy is still a guy who has a decision to make as we talk at 10:08 on Wednesday, January 15th. Both are still on the roster. But it's going to be a different looking receivers room at this point in time. It's right now, of course, and then in spring practice as well, and in 2025. And so the questions, I keep seeing them pop in. I'm not even sure where to start the conversation. The first one, of course, is your thoughts on just Omari Evans and Trey Wallace moving on. Obviously, that's something we've been talking about for a while over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. It's now official.
Yeah, I would say that's the place I would start. Is I was having conversations with our staff and just generally of trying to understand why these two would move on. And that's because I feel like they bent over backwards to put. So I have two thoughts here specifically on Omari Evans. Over the course of his 3 years, they bent over backwards to get him on the field, playing him as a true freshman when he wasn't ready just because he was incredibly fast. And providing that speed and field stretching ability. He has been given a lot of opportunity in the blue and white to make plays. Now, that being said, this past year, like I said on the show yesterday, it felt like he kind of had a role and he didn't get the overall trust from the team to be more than that. But then on the final play of the offense's the real honest final play, he doesn't fight through contested coverage to get to the football, runs a poor route, and is not in position. He runs 2 yards downhill instead of coming laterally across where Drew Aller expects him. And then the season's over. So, like, there are two sides of that in my mind to Omari Evans. The part that, to me, is really interesting is Trey Wallace's decision to move on, because he is the team's number one receiver. He was the team's number one receiver this past season. I wouldn't expect that to change, even with the players coming in, that he would be the guy that they would try to build the receiving concepts around. So that comes down to other reasons why he wants to leave. And I think that is one of those, it's time to move on sort of situations. And here we are getting what Penn State fans want and what they wanted, which is a massive reset of the receiver room. 4 players have moved on, as you mentioned. And then, of course, Julian Fleming can't return. So there's 5 players leaving the Penn State receiver room, including 3 of the top 4, and the other being Liam Clifford. I think it's interesting where Anthony Ivy fits into this conversation. He's not without talent, and now there's a lot of opportunity. There was a lot of opportunity already. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. But from this perspective, Greg, and this is where I think it's pretty cut and dried now, Penn State probably had a pretty good feeling on how these things were going to shake out, because this is now a 1-for-1 replacement. Devontae Ross, he brings similar skills in terms of being fast, deep threat, that post route against zone coverages and generally running fast across the field. That's the Omari Evans role. Kyron Hudson maybe isn't as fast, as Trey Wallace, but he's not super slow, and he is a physical contested catch, high point, great hands receiver that maybe provides more in that contested catch area, but is very similar in style maybe to Trey Wallace. So those are one-to-one replacements. They are no longer, we're not moving players around. We're not going to fit 4 of these guys into 3 spots. Those 2 replace the other 2 that just left. And that's in my mind, that's a pretty simple copy and paste for Penn State in the receiver room.
Yeah, I think that when you look at the reaction to these 2 portal entries, there's some Penn State fans, I'm looking at the comments now, and also the Lions Den message board over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, and for all the complaining about the receivers, there's also this sort of panic about both of those guys going in. I don't really understand how those 2 things can go hand in hand, but to me, I think you hit the nail on the head a few minutes ago. I think that we probably had just reached a point for both of those guys and for Penn State where it was time to go a separate way.
Yeah.
And obviously, I think both of them did some nice things at Penn State. Both of them had some catches that helped Penn State get to where it's gone, not just this year, but in previous years. At the same time, you look at what I think Penn State and what the players themselves hoped they would become at Penn State and what they ultimately produced. And I'm not sure that all of that ever matched what everyone's hopes and dreams were for that answer to be. So, and a question for you is, and I got this email a couple times and messages about this too. There's this new, I don't know if it's new, but talking point that Drew Aller not throwing to the receivers is part of the reason why their targets were down. They didn't have a catch in the Orange Bowl and so on and so forth. And there's been a lot of, I think, from some parts of the fan base throwing the issues with the receivers more on Aller than the receivers themselves. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's never just one thing. I think Aller's accuracy at times was not pristine, and the team did scheme a majority of targets for Tyler Warren. So I'm just bringing up right now the targets for the Penn State offense. Tyler Warren had 135.
Right.
So there's your answer. There's just the baseline. Here's your answer. Trey Wallace had 77 targets. He caught 60% of them. That's not a good percentage. And then the next target receiver is Nick Singleton. So there is a certain amount of targets that were given but not received. And there was a certain amount of targets that were not put on the frame, right? So like not put in a situation where they could be caught. And so it's never one thing or the other. And I think that maybe that's part of it. But also, Tyler Warren had a good year, catching 77% of his passes for 1,230 yards and 8 touchdowns. Like, it's not without reason to say that Aller isn't the reason these receivers were not productive, because there is a receiver that was productive. Nick Singleton had his best receiving season to date, of his career, and had 5 touchdowns in this offense. So everybody misses, whether it as a quarterback, whether it's accuracy or you miss a read. But when you're designing the offense to go through a tight end and he gets almost half, like we're getting closer to half of the targets in the offense. They had 422 targeted passes. He had 135. And so like, I don't want to do math live.
I didn't show up to do math. No, I didn't.
Yeah. It's not like, but it's closer to half than not. And so like, that's significant. And so I think there is an element of that. I do think there was an element of that with Keandre Lambert-Smith leaving. And so you can't dismiss it, but at the same time, I don't think it's entirely that. Like, there is that certain amount of, these guys also didn't develop the way that Penn State wanted them to. Like, they did not take the steps to be, somebody asked in the chat, like, how many contested catches did Trey Wallace actually have? Well, let me pull that up for you, because it wasn't 0, but it wasn't, he caught 54% of his contested catches. That's 12 on the season. So he did make those plays. Should he have been given more? That's the question, is should he have been given the ball in situations where the read didn't really dictate the ball goes there? And that's what the difference is in an offense, where it did with Tyler Warren and it didn't with Amari Evans or Trey Wallace. And I think, again, going back to Trey Wallace is the one that is the decision that is beyond targets and opportunity.
Yes, because he certainly had plenty of those over his time at Penn State. Will be very interesting to see where both of those guys end up. Certainly, Penn State fans, I think, look at some Penn State fans, not all, some look at those two hitting the portal and wonder if they'll go to a better situation or a better place, or will they get NIL money, so on and so forth. Keep in mind the same kind of receivers Penn State's looking for, other schools are too. And so, especially Omari Evans with his speed and Trey Wallace with his athleticism, someone or ones will definitely take a chance on trying to land those guys. So
those are good football players.
Yeah, they are.
Trey Wallace is going to be a good football player somewhere. I think that there is more to give, and I think that there is validity to when the chips are down, the quarterback trusted two players above the rest in terms of Nick Singleton as a check down and Tyler Warren as a primary read. I do think it is overstated to say they didn't get the receivers involved. They tried to force feed Trey Wallace in a couple of games to start. Like the target shares and where you go in the game and how the game plan and game flow develops, those are all important in terms of how you read the conversation. So the opening drive against Notre Dame, he received 2 targets, or in the opening quarter, he received a minimum of 2 targets that I can think of that were either not caught or inaccurate or thrown into contested coverage. So whatever the result is, they did target him on those plays. I feel like there was an effort at times to get Trey Wallace involved, but it wasn't sustained throughout the game. It was, okay, that didn't work. Let's go back to what works. And so maybe in my mind, it is the abandonment of that, of not being dedicated to pushing the ball to those players. That might be part of the conversation that is Trey Wallace, I think, has a legitimate gripe about that as the team's number 1 receiver that got 77 targets and was, thoroughly outshadowed by a tight end, which one of the best players in America, hard to argue. I see the argument from both sides for sure.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of Penn State's offense when there were failures this year and even when there were successes, but plenty of conversation to be had about not sticking with that or overdoing this and so on and so forth. That came up a couple of times with Andy Kotelnicki and the idea of going to the well too many times versus not enough. Yeah. And so this conversation is one of many you can have in that variety or in that vein. And certainly I'm sure it played a role in the decision for both of those guys to move on. Is Penn State a better receivers room with them both here or with one of them here in 2025? We'll see. I think that if we've learned anything over the last few years, it's that you shouldn't get too far down the path of either overhyping or underhyping guys that come out of the portal because either way, until you see him at Penn State and working on the field and with this group, with this team, it can be a little bit of a fool's errand to project exactly what a guy can be capable of based on what he did at a different school, in a different system, with a different coach, so on and so forth.
So with the 2 guys coming in, I do want to, we talked about this yesterday, and I just want to underline a couple more things that I think are important now that we know the final answer of Omari Evans, Trey Wallace, and how this is all going to fit. So Kyron Hudson is going to be an outside receiver, and in Andy Kotelnicki's offense, you'll line up in the slot. There'll be motions. Like, it doesn't, I'm not necessarily saying like he's always going to line up outside, but that's a primary spot for him as an outside receiver. Javonte Ross, at 161 pounds, I think that's the biggest thing I'm concerned by. He has elite speed. If one of these 2 guys explodes into a star in this offense in terms of big plays, all those things, Ross is the guy that I think has more potential for that, where Kyron Hudson is that classic possession receiver that is going to fight for the football. But when you talk about the things they bring, there is a little bit of a reflection in what Penn State just had. So Hudson is a tenacious, physical imposer as a receiver. And you did not get that from Penn State's receiving group. Even a guy like Julian Fleming fought as a run blocker, but when it came to being at the catch point, and honestly, he got so few targets, it's hard to say, like contested catch, not contested catch, but also watching the film, he never got himself open. So those 2 things go hand in hand. Aller's going to have to give Kyron Hudson some chances because he won't separate maybe even as well as Trey Wallace at times at his best, but he will absolutely fight for the football. So he's a guy that needs some opportunities. And I think it's that tone setter, that difference of let's get a reset in the mentality of the room. And then from Ross's perspective, I talked yesterday about some schematic fragility with Omari Evans. despite his size, he has produced in multiple places. He produced on the outside. He produced in the slot. There is an opportunity that he can use his speed against more than one situation. So using him again, and I'll just some of the things you see: deep crossers against cover 3. We didn't really see that from Amari Evans. We didn't see him get open and make those plays in those situations. We saw the one play that he was able to do, but just going deep in general, winning on those plays. I think that there was more to be had for Evans that didn't get some of those targets. That'll be on Aller to make that a priority if this guy is that of like an insane deep threat. But I think maybe there's a little more diversity, surprisingly, in Devontae Ross, who is smaller overall than Amari Evans, just because we've seen it on film, albeit at Troy. So that's the biggest wild card to me, is what Ross becomes at the next level.
Yeah, so those two guys are the newcomers to this room. There's going to be some newcomers to the snap sheet in a bigger way, or at least there should be, based on how this roster plays out in 2025. Yeah. Peter Gonzalez coming back from injury. Hopefully, if you're Penn State, you're hoping he can be back for at least some capacity of spring practice. We've talked about Tysier Denmark on this channel endlessly, and we'll see what kind of role he can earn for himself. There's some other guys, obviously, in the freshman and incoming class as well that will be looking to make a role. But I guess we might as well. I see it in the chat, so I'm sure you guys talked about it yesterday. I didn't get to catch the show, but this whole conversation of Marcus Hagans, fire Marcus Hagans, he's entering year 3 as
no,
Penn State's
we did
receivers
not talk
coach.
About that.
Okay, I'm surprised. That surprises me. Well, we might as well discuss it now. It all looks at this moment in time, 10:23 on Wednesday, January 15th, that Marcus Hagans will be back for another year at Penn State. And I think that you can't have a conversation about the totality of this receivers room and the problem it has had, the problems it has had development-wise for Penn State, without noting how much turnover there's been as it relates to who's coaching that room. And so I'm okay with going one more year with Marcus Hagans and seeing what comes next. But I know that's not the chat's going to light up right now, and I know it's not going to be an agreement. But I just think at this moment in time, you brought in what you've brought in with him as a recruiter over the last couple of years, both from the portal and from the high school ranks, and I think you give him another shot here to go after what Penn State thinks he's capable of. And of course, Mark Dupuis, who's an analyst who works with that room as well, is in the picture too. And time, this is obvious. It goes without saying, huge year for them. There's no doubt. Yeah. But I'm just not sure that the problems that everyone think exist in this receivers room are auto-solved by putting a new voice in charge of that room.
Yeah, so I think that you have to understand the situation. And going back to 2022, that's the room that this past year should have ascended into the group of players that make plays and are a part of the roster. And let's just review what they had. Let's talk. Christian Driver was a safety athlete who moved to the position, transferred out of the program. Mekhi Flowers is a safety athlete that moved to receiver, transferred out of the program. Caden Saunders, Anthony Ivy, Amari Evans, Tyler Johnson. That was the 4-man specifically receiving group that came in 2022. Saunders, the highest ranked player, has been injured and didn't turn into what they expected. Evans was the guy that started early and has produced, but outside of him, they have gotten nothing out of this group of players. Now let's go to 2023. So another opportunity here for Penn State to add receivers, and let's look at what they got in that class. They got receiver Carmelo Taylor. They got one player who is no longer on the roster, who did not make it through a full year at Penn State. And so Keandre Lambert-Smith, class of 2021, he transfers. It is not in a vacuum. So, the starting point for Penn State, which Marcus Hagans inherited, was a position group that had a lot of similar body types and players that had, this always sounds disrespectful, but it is the reality of recruiting, is like it is a kind of a lottery ticket when you get receivers. And these guys were players that didn't have the profile of immediate contributors, or guys that had the full body of potential. So all those didn't work out. And you can always, buck stops with the receivers coach. It stops with the head coach ultimately. And you can place none of the blame on the situation or the individuals on the field. I understand. But it is important to me watching these players, watching these talents come into the program. They had a problem. They tried to address it through the portal. Those players didn't work out. The portal has not been kind to Penn State in that particular room for all the reasons we've gotten into here over and over again. So they couldn't fix the problem that created by the previous receivers coach and his style of recruiting, and they couldn't get it fixed through the portal. In the class of 2024, they've got Tysier Denmark, Peter Gonzalez. I'm very high on both of those players in terms of their potential, their talent. Josiah Brown, I think, is similar to the guys that we just talked about in the class of 22 and 3 in terms of his play style and his potential. So you're not writing him off. You're just understanding what he is. And then you look at 25, and they did an excellent job closing and getting players that absolutely matter, including guys we love here on the staff, including Matthew Otten is a huge win for Penn State. I think that's a massive thing. And then Kobe Howard has the exact opposite profile these guys were talking about. This is a dude that is a good receiver, and we'll find out what he can do and grow with athletically. But we're talking about freshmen at this point. And the class of 2026 looks even better. They are turning the corner in recruiting, but if you can't fix it through the portal, talking myself into a mouthful of spit because this has been a, what is this now? 3 going on 4-year problem.
Right.
It doesn't get fixed overnight, especially if your lifeblood is recruiting and player acquisition through traditional means. So it's not something that Marcus Higgins is going to fix. And if you just say like, he's got to make the players on the roster better and that didn't happen, okay, I understand you don't have any sort of nuance or context in the conversation. You want the bottom line production, and that's what football is. But the pieces you have in the room matter, and they're getting better pieces. And so that's where I see an upward trajectory. The problem is Penn State's window is now. And so
right.
How do you bridge the gap? How do you make this work to win now? They couldn't get it done in 24. And I do think that there is a fear that there isn't development going on behind the scenes, but we don't know that yet with Tysier Denmark. We don't know because James Franklin and his staff, their plan is we're going to develop those guys and let them play when they're ready and not force them onto the field. So they make mistakes and lose confidence in front of everybody instead of, letting them develop and be good at football by the time you see them.
Big offseason for Marcus Higgins in that room. There's no doubt about it. Penn State does not need one of its freshmen or redshirt freshmen to be the second coming of Jeremiah Smith, the standout Ohio State freshman. But it certainly needs somebody to get closer to that ballpark. And then it needs Drew Allard, Andy Koldenicki to make sure the offense can go through that guy, which, again, I think the important thing to remember here is Tyler Warren cannot return. The offense will have to go through somebody else. Is it a receiver? Yeah. Is it another tight end? Is it the running backs? Time will tell on that front. We got a long offseason to discuss all of that. I want to thank Stephen Light for the Super Chat donation. Always appreciate it. I think that's going to be a term from T. Frank that comes up frequently in the offseason here.
I love it. Everyone seems to like it. And I when it came out of my mouth, I knew it hit. So that's good. That's good.
Stephen, thank you as always. Thanks for everyone being here on this edition of the BWI Live Show on January 15th. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel from Blue White Illustrated, which you can join for $1 for 7 days of access now to get the latest on the portal and everything else going on in the Penn State universe as the offseason truly kicks off. T. Frank, speaking of that, you mentioned at the beginning of the show, I think we've done enough on receivers. If the chat demands, we'll get back to it at some point. But I think we've successfully covered that.
25 minutes is absolutely enough time on that topic. Yes. It's the appropriate amount too.
Yes. So I agree. I would completely agree with you. But let's flip over to the defense because you mentioned it earlier in the show. Kobe King is moving on from Penn State. He did have the opportunity, if he desired, to come back for another season as Penn State's starting middle linebacker. He chooses to go to the NFL draft. As you can see there, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, he put out a graphic thanking everyone but Tom Allen. I know that was everyone made a big deal about that. To me, it's just whatever. It doesn't matter. Tom Allen's gone. Kobe King's gone, whatever. It'll come up at Pro Day. He probably not want to talk about it. Maybe he will. I hope he will, but probably won't. And that's just kind of that. So the big question, though, now, T. Frank, as we move into the 2025 conversation on defense, is Penn State. Kobe King obviously played a significant role for Penn State and this defense in 2024. And part of it was because he was one of its better defenders. That's why he was on the field. Obviously, the lasting memories of him being taken advantage of in coverage in the Orange Bowl will not, are ones that Penn State and its fans certainly wish were not the case. But he also played a lot because depth behind him was not exactly there. So I'm curious your initial impression. That's a big question that's being asked with not a great answer, at least in my mind at the moment. Where does Penn State turn at middle linebacker in 2025?
Yeah. It is not a clear answer right now. So here's the deal. And we're going to get this conversation with the center position in just a little bit. But in terms of the players that Penn State wants to play at that position, they want to play a veteran over a guy with the tools, the athleticism to make plays, because it is so important for your Mike linebacker to be a leader, a communicator, and to know the defense. Like, those are the things I'm trying to get at. You have to know the defense to the point that you can correct other people. And so if you don't have that credibility, you don't have that command, that's a massive problem. You can't really function not only from your specific role, but as the communicator and leader of the defense with the helmet mic now in modern college football. So who are the veterans? Well, you've got Dom DeLuca. I have a hard time seeing a former safety who isn't 6'4", and runs a 4.6 or whatever, like one of those safeties that was just a little bit too big to play at safety, playing at linebacker. Like, he's not Brian Urlacher, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then you have who are the other veterans in this roster? Tony Rojas at this point is a veteran on the roster at the position. Maybe he's a part of the conversation of moving him over from that will position to the mic, and maybe even bouncing him between the two. I don't know. But I think the one that makes the most sense, despite what we've seen of him so far in this in his time at Penn State, is Keon Wiley. Veteran. He came in. I've been impressed in the few snaps I've seen of him. He's in command of his job. He knows how to execute his assignment. He just hasn't been healthy. So if you're looking for what's the realistic outcome right now, my bet is Keon Wiley. The opportunity is there, and so the guy that needs to take that job is Tammy Robinson. So it is the third year for him and for Tony Rojas. And that was always the idea, right? When they were recruited, they would play next to each other as the two-man crew in the linebacker box and be the most athletic, most dynamic, largest pair of linebackers Penn State's had in recent memory. Tamir's had a long road to go in learning the position, and he struggled from a mental perspective this past year playing will, which is it's the athlete position. It's not as much of the thinking position as the Mike linebacker job. So that's going to be a big hill for him to climb. Does he play the position, though, next year? Does he see those reps as the Kobe King did with Tyler Elsdon in 2022, where he eventually takes more snaps as the season goes on? To me, I think that's the most positive outcome for Penn State, is they have a timeshare at Mike linebacker again next year. But I don't know if that's a reality or a possibility at this point, because Robinson hasn't shown what happens, what's going on there. And then you've got a couple of young players, Kari Jackson, Anthony Specca, Alex Tash coming in as a freshman. I don't know if any of those are ready yet. And again, you usually want a veteran, not a freshman or a redshirt freshman to play that position.
Dan Connor, of course, expected to be back, as all signs indicate he will be back as the de facto linebackers coach for Penn State. Of course, with Tom Allen moving on, we don't yet know who the Penn State defensive coordinator will be and what position specialty he may come with. We'll keep you posted on that as things develop at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. But yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head, T. Frank. There are a number of guys who make sense to fill Kobe King's role. Just a matter of whether they're ready to do it.
Who do you think is the best let's take away, the reality of it. Who's the best option in your mind? What's the best outcome for Penn State, saying X gets it and they turn into a great football player? Who's the best option, do you think, at that Mike linebacker position?
Yeah, it's a great question because, again, you look at where Penn State's at from a linebacker standpoint going into the 2025 spring practice season, And again, you return to Luca. You presumably return to Luca. He's a guy who still has not announced what he's going to do. I would have a hard time believing he won't be back, but time will tell. That is certainly he has an option to do something else if he so desires to do so. But when you look at how this roster shakes out, T. Frank, Kobe King 6'1", 248. At this very moment in time, you don't have anyone on the roster really in that ballpark. You have Kari Jackson at 238. You have Tony Rojas at 236. I would rule out Tony Rojas maybe being in that role some way, somehow, as a middle linebacker for Penn State. Probably not. I mean, it would probably pack on too much size for speed, but I'm just very curious to see what it's kind of hard. It's a little bit difficult to have the conversation until you know who the defensive coordinator is going to be. At the same time, it's important to remember that they will go to painstaking lengths for very good reason to make sure that whatever defensive coordinator hire they make, that person is bringing with it with him a style that blends with the very good defensive style Penn State has now become known for over the much of the James Franklin tenure. So, I think you're right about Tamir Robinson, absolutely. But is he ready for that moment? We'll see. Is Keon Wiley healthy enough and ready for that moment? I think that the hardest part with projecting that is you just haven't seen. You've seen some flashes from these guys, and you've heard some good things about these guys, but not enough. And I think that'll make spring practice enormous, obviously, for all of them. Moving into winter workouts and then spring practice, and you lose a leader too, which is another big thing. Obviously, DeLuca's still around; that helps. Tony Rojas, I think, probably grew into a leader some this year. You would think anyway, but you're losing a lot of leaders on that defensive side of the ball. Jalen Reed, KJ Winston, Kobe King, your defensive tackle group for the most part, not all of it, but Devon J. Thomas, certainly a big part of that leadership picture. So some other guys as well, Abdul Carter, of course. So a lot for a new defensive coordinator to sort out once, that person is picked, whether it's internal, whether it's external, time will tell. But certainly that middle linebacker decision is going to be one of the first keys for that new person to figure out.
Yeah, I don't know. This is even a situation where if there were a player in the portal, let's say that it's a former coach in the Big Ten or a former player at a school where the coach brings a linebacker with him so that you don't have to bring in a guy from a random school and there's that understanding of the defense. He can help even be, that kind of idea of the player coach on the field to say to everybody, here's how it works, line everybody up. I think that's even a possibility. I don't think it's a likelihood, but it would be something I would be considering. The coach and the coordinator, that's the first thing you got to, you're not going to do these things in the wrong order of which is a guy that can bring somebody with him. And that's the guy we choose. It's which one of these guys is the best coordinator, and then explore that opportunity or that option, even if the player gets to hear it, after spring football or whatever, to have another player a part of the conversation. So I think it's very much TBD. If there's obviously two spots that Penn State really needs in the portal. I think another receiver is important. And then you're talking about defensive tackle and then middle linebacker because of these things, because I don't see a good option for Penn State that has presented itself yet. But that's what spring ball is for. It's for these guys for us to find out who's made that progress, grinding on the developmental squad, on the practice squad, on the second or third team in the last year, to then take all that and be the guy for the moment. Penn State has talent. It's just that mental leap that I know, from my perspective, I've become much more hesitant of throwing any young guy into a spot and saying, there you go, height, weight, speed. It is, for especially that position, so much more about the mental aspect of playing fast, because Kobe King isn't dynamically fast, but he was so good at the position. He knew where to be, and he mitigated some of those issues because he was a really good football player.
How did you evaluate the play of the linebackers in 2024 overall? We obviously know that there were times when Tony Rojas and the group at large, but most I think would point to him, especially early in the season, missed tackles. There were times communication issues. Now, how much of that was on Tom Allen versus Kobe King versus whatever is obviously up for debate and will never be settled. But linebacker play in general, how would you evaluate that group this year? From what you saw from the start of the year through the college football playoff?
So I'm gonna give you some observations, and that's all I'm gonna do. These same players played in 2023, and I did not see the communication errors and the lack of clarity of assignment in 2023. Same football players with a year less experience for most of them. You saw those things persistent from corner to safety to linebacker this past season. So overall, I would say if you're grading all three players, I want to say I give him a B+, because Dom DeLuca, when he was healthy, made plays for this program. And Kobe King was really solid. You know, he has weaknesses in his game that nobody exploited until the final game of the year. And I think that's a credit to him and a credit to, just generally the plan for Penn State this past season. The part that everyone's going to bring up is the missed tackles in Tony Rojas. And, I think I have given him a pass at points this year because of that injury, and he played much better in the playoff than he did in the middle of the season. So he got better through that, and the confidence that he lost, I think, as part of that struggle, he was starting to get that back. But overall, that would be the weakness, right? You didn't get that explosive development that you felt like you were going to get in that Abdul Carter mode of this is a guy who's a freak athlete. He's playing early in his career. He's just going to make plays. That part didn't happen because even Abdul in his second year was trying to do too much and wasn't playing the game from a mental standpoint the way he needed to, because linebacker is hard. I would say linebacker is probably the most difficult position in modern football to be right because of RPOs, play action. Everything is targeting those players and forcing them into no-win situations. So when you're not just making plays in base defense in the fourth quarter and you're not allowed to just play fast, those things start to show up. So, yeah, I'd say for the group, B+ overall. But I understand if people don't agree with that.
Let's move to the offensive line. Penn State got some roster management news on that front Tuesday as well. We now know that Nick Dawkins will be back in 2025. We also know Sal Wormley will be going to the NFL draft as expected. He was out of eligibility. I guess he could have maybe tried to get a waiver for a medical redshirt and extra season if he wanted to, or if he could have tried that and maybe he was not able to. I'm not sure. Either way, he is moving on as expected. But it looks like everything we know at this moment in time is that the good chunk, we're still waiting on Venga Ioane to make his announcement. Drew Shelton, same thing. But everything we know at this point in time suggests that Penn State should have a good chunk of its starting offensive line back in 2025 from 2024. And I'm curious if that was your expectation at any point this year, and certainly as we got into the postseason. And then just your assessment of that group, how it played, because I feel like maybe, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I don't know if 2, but definitely, it wasn't all that long ago, we were having the same receiver conversation about the offensive line. Yeah. And now Penn State finds itself in a position where it is getting guys back at that spot who played well for an extra season and is happy about it. And I'm not sure how long ago that would have been the case. So just your initial thoughts on Dawkins in particular. Obviously, like we said, there's still some outstanding stuff as we talk about this at 10:45 on January 15. But if all goes what the plan looks like it's going to be, just your thoughts on this offensive line and what it returns next season.
So I think it has a chance to be the best offensive line Penn State has had under James Franklin. And certainly I think at this point right now, it has the best 2 deep, maybe even 3 deep we've ever seen, in my time, in my awareness of Penn State football, which is not super long, but in terms of, I'd say the James Franklin era, 11 or 12 years is not an insignificant amount of time. Right. And a lot of these guys are NFL and, maybe first round draft picks sort of players at tackle. We're thinking specifically of Anthony Donko. But Nolan Rucci, not putting him in that group, but is an NFL player. Like watching him play this past season, so that's impressive. To have that sort of depth and flexibility, they were able to overcome one of the worst injuries they could sustain, losing their most talented offensive lineman, who was an explosive space creator in the run game, and they were able to, once Nolan Rucci got comfortable and in the system and got some game reps under his belt, became an asset in the run game and was not a liability as a pass protector. So the issue this season was against the best competition with the best defensive lines and the best interiors. This group had kind of a ceiling. And part of that is you have 2 5th and 6th year offensive linemen in the middle who are good football players. They're veterans. They don't make a lot of mistakes, but you can beat them. So removing one of those guys introduces that variability that fans generally look at as this is the upside that is going to happen. I don't think you can, if you're Phil Troutwine, compare Cooper Cousins to the Pouncey brothers and then not feel like he's going to be an upgrade in certain ways, even if he makes mistakes this year. So I think the potential is there for them to be better, given that there is more variability for upside, but there is variability for downside. We just expect Cooper Cousins to be great. Like, that is the baseline understanding, Greg, right? I mean, am I being...
You can see it in the chat right now if you are otherwise mistaken or confused or otherwise. It's happening in the chat right now.
Yeah.
And no, you are 100% correct that the expectation is he's going to step in and be an All-American, and that's a little bit of a high bar. But
yeah,
at the same time, we've heard a lot of great things about him. And let's not forget, too, TJ Shanahan added to this mix as well, Texas A&M transfer.
I love
guard
that addition. Yeah. And
yeah.
So I actually wrote about that yesterday at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. You should check it out, because the one thing Nick Dawkins brings is something that James Franklin wants. And again, the mirror image of the middle linebacker and the center makes sense in this conversation of you want to bring a veteran back at that position. So go to the article and read just how many times Penn State's had a veteran at that center position. Actually, how many times they've had an underclassman starting at that position. You'll be surprised that there is an absolute rhythm to this. So Nick Dawkins brings a veteran leadership and gives them the space to breathe so they don't have to force a young guy into the same position that somebody is going to be on defense as a younger player playing that linebacker role. And TJ Shanahan has guard center versatility. He's incredibly smart. So I think he gives them the potential of, are they sharing reps at center? We've seen Penn State plan for the future, especially early in the non-conference season, giving guys reps at center. Hunter Norzad, they were supposed to play a lot more with Juice Scruggs, but then he got hurt.
Right.
So I expect there to be a battle for the future center position this year, instead of having the backup be primarily Dominic Rulli, who, you know, everyone loves Dominic Rulli. James Franklin has extolled the virtues of Dominic Rulli about his meaning to the program, but the long-term future at center is TJ Shanahan or Cooper Cousins. And I think the fact that they have an or there is really important, because it allows them to play Cooper Cousins, their potentially best offensive lineman, wherever that best suits him. And so that versatility, that upside, you know, it's massive. I don't want to understate it enough that I think TJ Shanahan can come in and play in his first year in a similar way to Nolan Rucci, and then be a starter at some point for the Nittany Lions. They have so much depth at all 5 positions now, where last year center was a real question. I don't have any questions about any of the positions or the depth coming into 2025.
We're going to put this episode of the BWI Live Show in a time capsule and see if we one day talk about the receivers in the same amount of time and years it took to talk about the offensive line in that very way. But you're right, T. Frank. Penn State, between its transfer portal additions and its high school recruiting, and also getting guys back for an extra season, now has one of the deeper offensive line groups in the country. It'll be fascinating when Phil Steele puts out his annual college football top position group rankings where this offensive line ends up, because I think it's probably going to be pretty high on that list. Moving over across the trenches to defensive tackle. Or defensive line, rather, not just defensive tackle, defensive line. But Smithville, go ahead.
This is from Eric Holmes here in the chat. He says, Michigan type without the cheating, bully ball in 2025. I would say that was you have that potential now with a guy like Devontae Ross on the roster. Just think, literally, Roman Wilson, a bigger guy, you know, in terms of height, but size-wise was probably a slot receiver. You know, I think that might be where he plays for the Steelers. So you have that opportunity of play action and explosive plays with a quarterback who, even though Penn State fans are not a fan of Drew Aller in the chat here, like I've been monitoring the chat, and there's a war of love and hate going on there, right? Like there is an absolute split decision on whether Drew Aller is even good at football. He is a first-round draft pick in the eyes of the NFL. That's it. Like so it's where and when. And if you have that mix of talent of the offensive line can be dominant and you have the speed on the perimeter, again, a tight end like Tyler Warren is a difference maker, but you don't get the same explosive 70-yard touchdown potential unless the dude runs a 4.4, 4.3. And so that space created by the size of the formation and the threat of the run, if you have somebody take advantage of it, you absolutely have that formula this year where you didn't in 2024 because your speed guys kind of had some limitations around them.
Right. No doubt about that. And again, it will be so much fun to watch, follow, talk about this offense over the next, 8 months, however long it is till Penn State football is back on the field. Because, again, it's a changing of the guard coming in terms of how this offense is run. It will no longer go through Tyler Warren. It will go through somebody else. Andy Kotelnicki has proven he will feature his best players in the offense. So who will those guys be? We'll spend a lot of time talking about that here and at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com over the months ahead. But defensive line, as we come down the home stretch here, finishing off the conversation so far with roster management and things like that. We now know Smith Vilbert will be back for a 7th season along Penn State's defensive line.
That's wild.
It is wild, yes. The COVID guys are starting to cycle out, so there's not too many more years, if any, we'll have this conversation. But Denai Dennis Sutton will be back for Penn State at defensive end. There's some other guys, I think, with some decisions still lingering. I could be wrong about that at this point. It all kind of runs together. But at this moment in time, obviously we know Abdul Carter is going to the NFL draft. Alonzo Ford and Zariah Fisher are the other 2 defensive linemen with decisions to make. I think both those guys are going to be back at this point in time. So concerns, strengths, pros, cons, positives, negatives, however you want to phrase it, T. Frank, of the Penn State defensive line going into the 2025 season.
Well, I want to get your thoughts on this. I feel like I filibustered for the entire show. So the defensive line, I think, is a big wild card in terms of they held the line, right? No pun intended. They held the line together, but what's the depth at this point? And what's the resiliency of this group? What do you think in terms of what they can be in 2025?
Yeah, so you start with Denai Dennis Sutton, which is awesome, but you do not start with an Abdul Carter potential freak moving down to the defensive line like Penn State had a year ago, or at least we don't think that's the plan at this point in time. Things can always change, but I look at this defensive line group and I think 2 things. One, they've always developed guys here. So the fact that they're going to have to do that again should not be a concern. You're going to have to help me because I cannot remember the defensive tackle they brought in from Michigan. Owen
Wafel.
Thank you. They bring him in to add some depth to this room, which I think is a great addition. And so I don't have a ton of concern about where this defensive line ends up in 2025. Does it take a step back? It might. Penn State got a lot of returners to that group that could have moved on last season, very similar to the way the offensive line looks like it's going to get guys this time around. So I think that should be noted, and the depth is probably going to be the biggest question for the Penn State defensive line in 2025. You have Denai Dennis Sutton, but who's who's on the other side at defensive end from him? Is it Zariah Fisher? Is it, are we going to get too far down the Max Granville hype train? Probably by the time August rolls around. I think there's a good chance that happens.
Yeah.
So there's some other guys that will, of course, be in that mix as well. But just very interesting to see who the next guy is besides Denai. But you can't overstate the importance of getting him back. There is just no doubt that whether or not you felt like he could have done a little bit more this year, and I have seen some comments out there, I'm not saying I agree with him, but I have seen that, whether you think he could develop more and help his draft stock, I don't think there's any question about that, but the guy's going to be talked about as a freak. And yeah, you mentioned in the chat, you have Anai White coming to this defensive line room as well. We'll see what kind of health. I don't want to go too far down the tracks with him either, because he's a guy who's fought injuries as well. We'll see where he's at for spring practice, but he's here, he's signed, he's on campus, so big deal there too. So all told, like what Penn State's done so far through the portal and through high school recruiting and through roster retention with its defensive line. And we'll see if that leads to the kind of success it had in 2024, but I think it's in a pretty healthy place at this juncture of the roster building season in early January.
Abdul Carter filled a lot of roles So he played 734 snaps, and I'm not even talking about like the celebrity appearances at linebacker and the things they did with him there. I'm talking about he was a base down defender and a third down pass rusher. Like, he took all the snaps. He was one that did not rotate nearly as much. So I think you can split that job into multiple roles with multiple people. We've seen them do that. The answer is all of the above in terms of, is it Smith Vilbert? Is it Zariah Fisher? Yes. They're going to have a 3-man rotation as the starting unit for sure. And then you get into who's going to be the situational pass rushers, where you're going to find the speed off the edge, because none of those guys necessarily have that. We need to have a new bid if T. Frank gets unreasonably high on a prospect or a player, because I keep thinking about Chaz Coleman. Chaz Coleman is the most physically potential laden player Penn State's had in a long time. He's 6'5", he moves it like a speed rusher and can probably be 255, 260. How close can he get to that in his freshman season when he's not an early enrollee right now? That's obviously the part that's a massive leap for me to make. But Max Granville did it, albeit he did it. That's the thing, is like Max Granville was 235 or somewhere around there when he showed up, and he was a part of the conversation. He was getting snaps to replace Abdul Carter by the end of the year. So maybe not at the beginning of the season, but mid-season are some of those young guys. This is specifically about defensive end.
Right.
Are some of those young guys, Malachi Williams, Jalen Harvey, where are they in their development curve by October? And how does that set them up for a potential playoff run? Because, all those things are on the table. You can lose more than once, right? And so you need to beat the good teams on your schedule, all that stuff. But in terms of reinforcements, I think that there is, for this upcoming season, a potential wave of players that actually contribute down the stretch for this team, as opposed to this year, which it never really materialized. And then on the interior, people keep asking about Liam Andrews. And I think that's a great question. We're going to find out more here in a couple of weeks. BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, that, we've talked about him more there. I don't have any of that information for you right now. But the players I'd say that it's a big offseason for Ty Blanding and for Xavier Gilliam. Both those guys were the two that were at the top of the depth rotation, but when it mattered, they did not see the football field, right? So in the playoffs, it was a 3-man rotation at defensive tackle. So those guys need to prove that they're ready to step into that role next to Zane Durant. And those are your starting names at the very least. I like Blanding, and I think the staff obviously really likes Gilliam. Having those guys on accelerated timelines are absolutely important, and I think that there should be some optimism about some of these young guys contributing, especially if Alonzo Ford returns and is healthy in time to be a factor this year. My concern is the kind of the PJ Mustipher situation, right? Where he was injured so late in the year. Does that affect what happens to him next year? And is he able to, maintain those gains he's made physically while in his time at Penn State, and how, he plays with athleticism despite his size. And that's a very important part of his game.
Obviously, Zane Durant coming back, a huge part of the equation for Penn State as well. A huge retention there. So the Penn State roster is starting to take shape for the 2025 season. More announcements to come, more updates to follow, whether it's via the portal, whether it's via high school recruiting. Obviously, for 2025, that's just about wrapped up at this point. But you never know. Surprises happen. So,
yeah.
T. Frank, as we roll through the end of another BWI Live show here on Wednesday, January 15th, any just overall summations, thoughts, on how this offseason has started for Penn State? I think we can all agree Tom Allen moving on, probably the biggest of all of the new, quote-unquote news, or quote-unquote headlines, or quote-unquote announcements.
You wanted to talk about kind of the end of that story. So what happened with Tom Allen to kind of put a bow on everything for Penn State fans in terms of the Clemson side of things?
Yeah, so they offered him a 3-year deal that total $6 million, and he, of course, signed that after it was approved by their board of trustees on Tuesday. As he said in his statement, as Nate Bauer reported earlier this week, family, big part of this decision, maybe the significantly most important part of this decision was getting close to his family in the Carolinas, and he thought that he had a chance to take advantage of what he, I think, called a unique opportunity. So It is what it is for Penn State. I think most Penn State fans probably would have assumed, I think media members as well, that his tenure would have lasted more than a year. But, at the end of the day, these things happen in the coaching industry. The carousel spins, and you never know when it's going to stop for one of your coaches if you're James Franklin. So I don't think it's the end of the world. I think they will be A-OK finding somebody who can keep the defense at the standard that it has been obviously set at for the better part of the James Franklin era. And we'll have to wait and see who that person is. But, yeah, all told, T. Frank, I think that's probably the most unexpected part of the start of the offseason. Everything else has kind of been fairly, I would say, again, maybe you thought Katron Allen was going to leave or Nick Singleton was going to leave. Maybe you thought they'd keep one of Omari Evans or Trey Wallace. But I think from a general sense, none of it is so crazily shocking that it tops Tom Allen leaving after just one season. So that's kind of where I'm at with it at this point.
I'm interested to see how two things happen here. First off is we never really acknowledged the reality that Penn State had three new coordinators, and specifically what I am aware of in terms of like what happened on the field. Penn State's biggest procedural problems on offense were the center didn't hear the snap count from the quarterback when he wasn't lined up under center. There was not a whole lot of mental errors and busts that were obvious on film. Now, there were some things that teams did that caused communication issues with the offensive line. That happens to every offensive line, but there weren't the receiver doesn't know where he's going that we saw previously from Penn State offenses. And I think that is a credit to the coaching staff and James Franklin for having that accelerated adoption of new coaches into the program. Here is the challenge. The coach, and this is how James Franklin has described it, this is how the process goes. You're coming here to run Penn State's defense, which is a certain loose set of parameters that have skill player and schematic rigidity in terms of you're not running an odd front here. You're not going to be running something pure zone coverages when we've developed this pipeline of good press cover corners. But within that, you can be as creative as you want, and you can find your voice within that system. They're hiring people that fit that system anyway, so it is a natural fit. Andy Kotelnicki was able to develop an offense within the parameters of having Drew Aller as the starting quarterback and having the offensive skill players around him where they made the Final Four. Like, you can say that the offense never fit and clicked and all those things, and they're true. They also made the Final Four. Tom Allen's defense, I would say, was surprising to me, where it felt like he struggled to fit into that and come up with the same sparks of ingenuity and creativity that we saw at Indiana. And maybe part of that is the defensive staff that was at Indiana and less about the head coach. And more, maybe it was just the first year of getting back into being a defensive coordinator and trying to work through those kinks. It didn't hit the way I expected. And I think it didn't hit the way the Penn State fans expected this season. So does the next coach bring what I just described of that creativity and that ability to generate plays that put players in position to succeed and take advantage of deficiencies in the offense without being, this is who we are, this is what we're running? And so I think that's, to me, the most interesting thing about the next defensive coordinator is, do they have that profile and do they get that done? Because I'm confident that the integration will be fairly good based on what we saw this year with the coordinators and how the team handled putting in a new offense and a new defense.
Well, that is something we will continue to break down and follow at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. That'll do it for today's BWI Live show on Wednesday, January 15th. Remember, it's $1 for 7 days of access to the latest intel on the transfer portal, coaching changes, and much more. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. T. Frank's back with the recruiting show with Ryan and hopefully Sean tomorrow on Thursday, and then we will take you into the weekend with everything you need to know about Penn State football as you need to know it here on the BWI Live show and the BWI YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.